Join me in welcoming Danielle Beazer Dubrasky.
So thank you again. It's a pleasure to be here, and I've had a chance to hear some of the participants earlier today, and it's been lovely and just wonderful. So this title of the presentation, Ways of Seeing Perspectives of Landscapes in Poetry, is one that I've been interested for a long time, in part because of the notion of how we connect to landscape, but also the idea of home. So what I'll do this evening is read a few poems that demonstrate a little bit of how I write about landscape. And I will say I'm not a photographer. I'm using any photography or any artistic ideas regarding landscape very loosely. So just going to put that out that I'm using them more from what they have done for me. But I do want to point out, this is a painting by Arlene Braithwaite, who's an incredible landscape artist, incredible plein air painter. And so it ties in with kind of what I'll be talking about through the course of the presentation. So landscape, what I like to do with words is to kind of mine their meanings, the etymological history of words. And so I began to break down, well, what is the meaning of landscape? Typically, the picture representing natural inland scenery, but I also broke down, well, what is land, what's behind that, and what is behind the word scape. And what's interesting about the word land is it means both an enclosed space, if you can see this, in Welsh, an enclosure, but also in Cornish, an open space. So it kind of has that notion of these two different ideas, open and closed. But I was really interested in the idea of scape, and going to the middle part, skeep, to shape, create, ordain, appoint, that a way in which the land is shaped, it is ordained, it is in some way, as we look at it, we frame it in a certain way. And so the land becomes something different in terms of our framing of it or how we organize and outline it. So going further to the idea of ordain, which is to confer holy orders, to consecrate, set apart, sanctuary, holy ground, setting aside space and giving it form, creating space that making it holy, it becomes sacred through its designation. And I use the word sacred in a very, again, sort of loose way, but it becomes significant to you. And if you think about the landscapes, think for a moment about the landscapes that are a part of your memory, a part of your background. And they can be cityscapes or landscapes, but what do they look like to you? How are you framing them? What is it that you are seeing that makes them distinctive to you, but also how do they connect to you? What is it that they bring to you, and vice versa? Simon Schama is a British historian who wrote a book called Memory and Landscape. And he did research about how different cultures in Europe connected to their landscapes historically. What did it mean to them in a historical sense? And then what does it mean to them now? And what have they lost in the process of that evolution of time? And one of the most interesting parts is when he talked about Germany. And some of you might be aware of this. Prior to World War II, actually for centuries, the Germans had a very strong connection to their forests. The woods and the forest and the woodland, there was almost a visceral connection. Children would learn about the trees, the plants and all that in the forest. They would sleep near the trees. There was just this almost like a very close attachment to that. And then what happens during World War II? Where are the concentration camps sometimes placed? And some of them were placed in forests. And when people began to be aware of that after World War II, when some of the German people became to be aware of that, suddenly that place that had felt so sacred and so connected, and they were such a part of their identity, became a kind of site of shame. And it wasn't until about the 1970s that some artists began to do portrait or paintings in which they would have trees along with barbed wire. These were German artists, in a way kind of reconciling what had happened to that land, what had happened to that connection, and acknowledging some of that history. So I love this idea from Simon Schama that when we think about landscape, and the landscape, if we see them every day, the shape of the landscape becomes integrated into ourselves. When we remember landscape, the scenery is built up as much from strata of memory as from layers of rock. And that is such a timely quote, I think, for this particular area as well, and pretty much anywhere in Utah. And then for me, because of my own experience in terms of the idea of home, landscapes can haunt us. If we leave them behind, they become emblematic of a lost home. So again, think about the landscape that you feel close to. And now think, is it a landscape that you can go to often? Or is it a landscape that you are looking at from the sense of time in the distance, it's in the past, but it still is shaping who you are or shaping some of that memory? So I grew up in Virginia, and this is the landscape that I was familiar with. And I know we have another Virginian, that she's here, but anyway, we're talking a little bit about the Blue Ridge Mountains. I grew up in Charlottesville, which is in central Virginia, and we would often take drives through Skyline Drive, through the Blue Ridge Mountains. So this is the landscape that I grew up around. I also grew up near the University of Virginia, or that is what is in Charlottesville, and this is one of the walled gardens that is in that's part of the University of Virginia, and well-known. These are famous gardens, and the wall behind it is called the Serpentine Wall because of the curves how it is designed. It's a very beautiful pastoral scene, and this is one that I was very close to growing up. I wasn't aware until later when there began to be more historical movements toward, well, what really is in the past, especially in Virginia, in light of slavery. And there began to be more voices that were trying to make people aware that enslaved people were the ones that in fact gardened here. They were the ones that built some of the buildings. And that history had been subsumed. As a child, a young teenager, I wasn't aware of that. But now these walls have a different meaning to them than they did for me growing up. And again, there's that kind of sense of our landscape, what it means to us, but also historically, what are some other hidden stories that are there as well. When I was a freshman in college, my father died of a heart attack suddenly, and about a year later, my mother decided to move to St. George and kind of start a new life. And she was from Provo originally, and she wanted to go somewhere where it didn't snow. So she chose St. George, and this would have been back in the mid-'80s or so. So that was a change, that was a transition. I stayed behind for a week to help pack up the house. And when my brother and I flew from Washington, D.C. to where we were going to be going, well, what airport are we going to fly into if we're going to St. George? Las Vegas. And I don't mean to diss anybody who's from Las Vegas, but this was a landscape I had never seen before. And having been full of kind of the emotions that I was having at the time, I was just overwhelmed with grief about this, what am I leaving behind? Where am I going? And at that age and that time, it was very disconcerting. But then we look at what I discovered and what is discovered, really what is here, what is a different landscape altogether. And I loved when Morgan, in her presentation last night, she talked about, I believe she said, the land tells a story and the water edits it. And that's such an amazing statement to make regarding how landscape is shaped. So that gives you just a little bit of background regarding my own connection of landscape, my own idea of home. And so now what I'll do is talk a little bit about how do you consider landscape? Whoops, go back. Okay, so think about that landscape that you have in mind for yourself and what that is, what that looks like. What are the images in one's poetry that makes a place sacred by being designated through specific details? So it's going back to that idea of landscape being land that's set aside, kind of made holy in the way in which you designate it because of the details, the connections, the ideas that you have about that landscape. So just think about that for a moment for yourself. If you were to describe that landscape to someone, you might think about, well, what is in the background, what's in the foreground, what are the details that you fill in for that landscape? And as you describe those details, why those details? Why those in particular? So this is a book called Invisible Shores. It was published by Red Butte Press, and it's one that actually visually illustrates this idea of landscape and poetry in this accordion book. This was designed by Marnie Torrey Powers at Red Butte Press. She came down to Cedar City and she took photographs of a fire that was happening at that time called the Schertz Canyon Fire. And then two of my poems were put into this accordion book. So I'm going to read one poem, and as I read it, just consider the way in which I describe sort of background, foreground, and fill in the landscape space. But also at this time, you can tell that I am sort of in between two places. Great Basin. I am no nearer to what the sea tries to loosen, wedged in rock, a sorrow slipped between trapped metal cap and a glass shattered along another coast. The truth is, I don't live near the ocean, but in a desert town I refuse to see, built on an alluvial fan of gypsum soil shifting between cracked plaster and skewed door frames, beneath miles of silver sage, rabbit brush, dry lakes, and wind trembling through pinyon rooted along the highway. I leave my own trace, planting wisteria and honeysuckle, southern foreigners thirsting for water. I blink, and the town is gone, drowned in a sea of fossils. What that sea left behind is the desert I walk through, a sorrow slipped between shale and trilobites. So in that poem, hopefully you got that sense of space, but then focusing on some smaller details, but that idea of space. I'm now going to just read a few poems from this book, Drift Migration, which came out during the pandemic, so it's a little pandemic book, still finding its place. But I'll read a few poems that demonstrate some of the questions I have about how we write about landscape. And again, these are very general questions. So what is in the background? I already mentioned that. And what is in the foreground? And how is it that that space is going to be described to give the sense of the emotional journey that you take when you're describing that landscape, when you are connecting to that landscape? I'll start with this poem called Vespers in the Great Basin. And as I read this, consider what you, as I read this, I start sort of from a distance, seeing something coming in, and then focus on a detail. And then there's a little bit of pulling back and then coming back into that sense of distance. So there's just that nice notion of what is in the background, what is in the foreground. And I'll read a couple of poems that demonstrate that a little bit. Vespers in the Great Basin. Bald eagles gather among the elms with soft whistles as they glide over snowfields of thistle and jackrabbits, settle on branches, umber wings folded against their bodies, albino heads tucked from the wind. Each winter we watch them fly across the valley to this empty ranch, stretch their wingspan beyond 6 feet, their darkness growing in sunset until Venus appears in the west. Driving home, your right hand fumbles with my fingers as if with a rosary, while your left keeps the wheel in check. Out the window, I see a brown quarter horse lean against a fence in snow, haunches turned to the wind. Our silence meets the coldness that blows in through door jambs, the chimney. Next January, when mountain peaks glisten beneath miters of ice, we'll return to the elms as eagles gather across the river and the riven valley. They'll hunch together on racked branches of winter trees, still believing they can keep the cold at bay. So hopefully what you noticed was the way that distance was used, seeing these eagles fly in, the darkening sky, and some of the ways in which I filled in the details. But there's also an emotional resonance that is happening with that idea of landscape. So another poem, and this is, you were just talking earlier, Barry, about the bighorn sheep, I think, was that what you mentioned? So this is another poem that has that idea of background, foreground, but what's all the emotional stuff that's happening in between. It's called, and going back to when I arrived into the Southwest for the first time in that area, when we drove through the Virgin Gorge and I saw the stars and I thought, oh, this is indeed a magical landscape. This is called Winter Solstice in the Gorge. Our myths turn long nights into cut evergreen, sold on grocery store parking lots, a continent away from reindeer starving as the Arctic ice dissolves. Only one star guides the way for diesels lit like Christmas, miles of commerce that thread the Mojave. The longest night spills from a cup of tears I drink through this highway that weaves between monoliths of an American Stonehenge along the Virgin River's winding course. At the hour's cusp, I see her face in the rock, Freya, who carries the sun in antlers. She spins a wheel around our breath, seeds the earth, she spins a wheel around our breath, seeds the earth with bits of amber. At dawn, the sun stands still on a plateau of kaibab sediment, reaches its rays down gypsum layers, touches sandstone near bighorn sheep who step out of shadow. So with that last line, there's kind of this descending moment and then ending on this detail. So another question that you consider, or that to consider, was what is the line of horizon? And in these poems, I've already kind of described a little bit of a horizon. In this next poem, there's more of a sense of that. So I'll read this poem and then one more poem that are these shorter poems, and then I'm going to shift to a longer poem called The Sandman. And this poem is a very dark fairy tale. I wrote it before Neil Gaiman. I actually haven't read Neil Gaiman, so I just want to say, put that out. If there is an intersection, it is completely unintended, I would say. So I'm going to close the discussion with that. But this poem is called Evensong, and it's one in which that line of horizon becomes a kind of marker, again, for a sense of place and a sense of home. Evensong. Sunbeams scatter through oxygen and nitrogen, bending frequencies into a band of blue, gray, and white, swallowed by waves of nautical twilight. The moment Venus appears next to Algol, the demon star, and Lambda. Astral boat lights floating on a January horizon. Home is scattered. Red hills on the east, a dry basin to the west, and in between, a town of 3 exits where I have lived out the same day for 30 years. A glossy magazine promises vacations to Denmark, Bali, Alaska, where oceans beat the shores with breakers from our first breaths, before our lidless eyes could no longer see through water. At a wind gap, symbols on rock carved by Fremont Indians tell of the equinox, rain, a journey, a woman giving birth. Cirrus clouds over the Pine Valley Range must mean thunderheads building in Nevada. They should reach us by tomorrow night. So finally, the last 2 questions what are the smaller details? And you've noticed those already in some of these poems. But what I'm also becoming interested in is do this again. On what details, sorry, we'll go back. This is a fly-in one, so I just maybe need to do that, and then I'm going to have to go back, I think, to the previous one. That's not working. Well, okay, the last, no, okay, we're just going to leave it at that then. The last question that I had is what detail does the poem rest on? So just think about that. What's the last detail the poem rests on? So the last poem I'll use to kind of demonstrate this idea is a poem called All Fever Gone, and I jokingly call it a Bridgerton poem. So you can take that as you will. All Fever Gone. And again, space, starting this as space, and then focusing, and coming down to a very small detail. All Fever Gone. A storm over sandstone hoodoos obscured Bryce Canyon's sharp blue sky. We sheltered in a rock alcove beneath black clouds, our shirts soaked with rain, your lips browsing the nape of my neck. Then thunder flashed. We never knew how close lightning struck. The others waited inside the lodge, your sister and her fiancé. At her wedding, we slipped away past the gazebo, disappeared into trees like deer, like foxes, skipped over river rocks, and lay on the other side until the night shed cold stars. We returned for toast, dancing, cutting of the cake, when her husband smashed red velvet into her mouth, licked it off. Years later, we meet off I-15 at Fort Deseret, take photos of each other in door frames of old dugouts, adjusting apertures for light. This is the country where I remain, all fever gone or slipped between volcanic peaks and Triassic hills into a land charred by arches, pinnacles, layers of basalt. In the matte print, you lean your shoulder against adobe walls. Behind your smile, the miles of desert beyond the confusion range touch the Nevada border and reach me 30 years later, putting the dishes away. So in that poem, there is that kind of notion of resting. So the last quote that I'll bring up here is from a theorist, a poetics theorist, Gustav Bachelard, and I talked about him earlier in the poetry workshop I did, from the Poetics of Space. He says, the imagination, by virtue of its freshness and its own peculiar activity, can make what is familiar into the strange. With a single poetic detail, the imagination confronts us with a new world. From then on, the detail takes precedence over the panorama, and the simple image, if it is new, will open up an entire world. So that concept, panorama versus this very distinct image in relationship to landscape, and what it comes down to is that single image is what opens up your connection to that landscape. So I'm going to shift now. First, I just want to ask any questions about any of this. So we'll do just maybe a short little Q&A. Then I'm going to shift to the Sandman poems, and we'll finish up with that. Any questions regarding this idea of landscape, in poetry, in imagery, perspective? Anything coming to mind about the landscapes that you have in mind, that you're thinking about, as to how you would describe them? Still thinking about? Yeah, sure.
I wonder, how do you decide when you're working on a poem, like, how do you decide whether you're starting with the panorama and narrowing to a detail, or starting with the detail and stretching out, or like, how's the shape of the poem come to be?
That's an excellent question. Yeah, it's an excellent question. And it really has to do with what is the image that's prominent in my memory.
Can you repeat the question for the...
Oh, yes. So the question is, how do you decide whether you're going to have the panoramic, like you're going to start with a panoramic view and come to the detail, or if you're going to start with the detail and then end up with a panorama view? And for me, it has to do with what is the memory that's most vivid. So when we went out, my husband and I went out to look at these eagles at the ranch, the abandoned ranch, that was vivid to me, was seeing them come in and seeing the light change and seeing them roost and all of those details. And as I began to write about that, and especially the winter, and sometimes winters in Cedar City can feel kind of bleak, and we have an old house. In fact, that first poem that I wrote about the cracked plaster and skewed door frames, because there's a little bit of settling in some of these older homes. I don't think I'll ever be hired by a real estate agent to kind of sell some of these older homes there, because there's a lot of kind of settling that happens. And so as I began to write that poem, other things came to mind in terms of the imagery, and I believe the image of the horse and the haunches and the fence, that was probably from someplace else, and so it just seemed to fit in with the mood and the tone of that poem. And then finally, going back to that idea of the eagles, it just felt like a natural return to that. When I wrote All Fever Gone, I again sort of had that sense of this is the detail, this is the landscape, these are the people I'm thinking about, but I did want it to end on this kind of gesture of of domesticity that has more meaning to it than just that domesticity. So it kind of found its way as to, what's the most mundane thing you can do, in a day, which is maybe putting away those dishes. So it's a more of an organic experience, but it does start with, well, what's the most vivid image that I have, and then goes from there. So good, yes.
Please come to the microphone.
Yeah, my question was, you actually led into it really well at the end there, which is just what kinds of details do you find your eye drawn to, and what is it, maybe what is your frame of mind? What are you looking for in terms of that last detail?
That last detail. And that's a really good question, because again, it's a kind of an act of discovery, and sometimes it is what's happening in the poem that will give me a notion of that last detail. So the one even song, when I was trying to think, how do I end this about this notion of time and water and what's happening, and I thought I want some sense of having some a signal that something else is coming into this space, and that's the clouds from Nevada. What's going to be coming to us next? And so I did hunt around. Well, what's the right phrase? What's the right way to say this? But I wanted to end with that notion of there's an anticipation that things will continue. This is not like a place that's stuck. Things will continue in that way. But often it's kind of an organic process that one image sort of leads to the next one. So with that question in mind, I'm going to lead into the Sandman poem, and then we'll finish up with additional questions. I think there should be time. Because with this particular poem, I wanted to, the Sandman poem, this one, again, it takes a very dark aspect of the Sandman fairy tale, the myth. And I wanted to address that myth with some kind of another image that would counteract the Sandman myth. And so I deliberately did some research to think, I wrote the first few poems, and I thought I need something else that's going to contrast the darkness here. And I did some other research, and I found what I would call, maybe not quite a healing image, but it was an image that creates that contrast. And in that case, it was a very deliberate act to find that image before I continued the rest of the sequence. So there's just a few terms that you'll need to know. One is the term forum shells, F-O-R-A-M, shells. They're very small shells, the tiniest shells. And then the other is the Sirius flower, which is a desert flower that flowers only once a year. So I'm going to go ahead and read this poem. I'll read it without breaks, but I'll let you know it's a 10-part poem, and then I'll close with one final poem, then we'll have the Q&A, more Q&A. But in this poem, again, you'll notice space, landscape, and zooming in on details, and then doing the panorama, and vice versa. And it does end on an image that I had to really, it took years to find the image that ends up finally in this poem. The Sandman, 1. This is the story of two children who wander into the desert and see a burning bush, creosote, the oldest plant on earth. The smell of it after rain is of railroad tracks crossing desolation, passing all the lives scattered at the root of the chaparral. The brother and sister have followed him, the man who coaxed them toward a mirage with the promise they would see God. In the desert, there are circles of seeds, tracks of snakeskin, diadems of sunflowers crushed into a map. He does not give them manna, but hops and hashish. He takes them into the desert that sparkles at first of crushed jewels. The sand shifts, the diamonds cut their feet. He takes them into the desert and says, hush. He is not waiting for them to grow up, but to soften and fatten by feeding them sweet things. But no, that story belongs to two other children. 2. The brother and sister are never very close except once at the beach when they leave pennies on the railroad tracks that run behind cottages, Lincoln's face, the Capitol, flattened into diadems they throw into the ocean and trade out for shells. They walk along the shore on Sundays, a mother at church, father at the office, scouring the beach for bits of conch or nautilus, their loneliness woven into the grains. They track sand into the house and watch the Brady Bunch, the sun flaring into a copper penny bright with the face of God. End of summer. Their parents pack the station wagon, drive all night across the Mojave to kill the heat. The brother and sister watch car lights stream across the windows, both hoping to see a shooting star, but the children spin beneath the sky so quickly they are the ones burning through space. 3. They are too old for shooting stars by the time they find the desert. They walk railroad tracks, leaping over ties, collecting debris, bottle caps, buttons, coins, bracelet, what slips out of other pockets into theirs. The first time they see the Sandman, he is across the tracks, holding a small bag of sand in his fist. He spins the grains into a kaleidoscope: garnet, black magnetite, green epitote, red agate, feldspar, calcitite, silica, fossils, bits of coral, sea urchins, forum shells. He spins music on a turntable, snaps a dance with his fingers, pulls a rainbow of scars through a ring, shades them from the sun. He shows how the city rises from its ashes at dawn and disappears into a flame at night. One night, he whirls the kaleidoscope into a windstorm so strong the brother and sister can't hear each other's voices. He pours fire down the brother's throat and leaves him pushing grit between his teeth. While the sister sleeps, he stills her eyes. So when she wakes years later, she can't see the split he left in her heart. 4. The brother veers off the highway at the age of 19, an empty bottle of vodka tipped beside him. There is no cross in the shoulder where he crashes into the valley of fire, valley of sun, valley of the shadow of death. There is no mark of the mirage where the Sandman left them without water. There is sometimes rain or other times voices, and always wind carrying litter, bits of tinfoil or newspaper lines, a witness to other lost lives. There is no way to open the door to the Sandman's eyes. 5. She wants to remember what it was like to listen to the train whistle and clack its wheels outside her window, a night hot as knives circling her skin, never cutting the flesh for blood, just scraping small scars. What freight did those cars carry in and out of the desert on tracks that were like Jacob's ladder to her, a conduit to a place beyond the nights she slept with her eyes open, beyond the mirror each morning, her face closed as a stone. 6. The city blooms into pools of blackness at night. Millions of car lights open across the desert. The sun shifts its glare farther west, and tarmac snakes begin to cool down. A constant tread wears away the skin, breaking it into diamond chunks, and the sister drives through the city, the Sandman's voice whispering, "Don't sleep, don't sleep, don't meet yourself in the space behind your eyes." She searches the dune for prints from 30 years ago. Wind abrades quartz shaping the inland sand seas. Her brother is in all the grains. It is his broken face she has been staring at. The sounding dunes bellow with a deep call, and she sings back until the wind sows a seed into her heart's cleft, the night blooming Sirius. It takes root in her septum, drinks from her vessels, vines begin to fill the chambers choked with sand. They wait the one night in a year to flower. 7. She walks through dead zones between creosote bushes whose roots take in so much water, nothing else survives. The waxy leaves and yellow leaves still look the same. "He's close," she whispers, as if her brother could hear. But she is alone in the desert. That once sparkled of jewels, which she now sees are glass, tinfoil, beer can tabs, ordinary objects she sifts through her fingers. Was he really here, she wants to ask the boy, who threw pennies with her into the Pacific before his eyes grew glassy with the Sandman's breath? But she lost him so long ago. She is now half a century, so young compared to the chaparral of nearly 12,000 years. If she thinks the legend never existed, does its power die? But this legend has a man's voice, a man's body. "He's here," she says to the rain that releases resin from chaparral leaves, burning with the scent of railroad ties. 8. Tiny fronds pressed around the Sirius stamen push the outer petals to open in her heart. 9. He appears as an ordinary man taking an evening walk, except for the small bag of sand he carries. He looks at her as though no time has passed, as though there is not one where there were two. I brought a special one for you, he says, and opens his palm to show a star-shaped grain made from the shell of the tiniest creatures. Its 6 points are delicate, milky white. She has never seen anything so beautiful and small. She finally sees his hand for what it is and what it was, a wasteland thriving on fragments of once living creatures. You can't feel the scar from where you took the eyes to my heart, she says. 10. There are some who wait all their lives to see the queen of the desert bloom at midnight. The phoenix falls into city lights burning for miles, and a crescent rises above the skyline. Heady perfume opens across the desert, and she sees them all now. Ghost flower, evening snow, Venus shooting star, their grace thrives despite the arid soil. She feels more than seeds, the moonlight petals expand in her dark place of sand and blood. The Sandman's bag splits open and all things past spill out of her heart. It's only me, she whispers to the boy, who wandered the track with her as if he could listen. And it is only her, the sister, leaving the desert. She places a penny beneath the burning bush. And that's the Sandman poem, the end of that. So I'm just going to close with one more poem, and this is, again, kind of in homage to what was being talked about earlier, which are petroglyphs. Thank you. And so this is called Petroglyphs at Parowan Gap. And again, you'll notice the way there's a space, there's the distance, and then coming in even closer. All things crisscross before they disappear into a silence throbbing between jutted rocks. A trucker drives on a road perpendicular to the wind gap, visible for a moment, then gone. A Pontiac guns from the closest town swerves toward me, honks, and the men spin away, laughed at my startled jump. I give them the finger. We break the reverie, summoned from eons of layers that streak rock masked with graffiti. Names trespass a map carved 5 centuries ago in sandstone. Notches, ladders, sun circle of concentric rings that gives passage to the next traveler. If we live in dreams, our eyes opening and closing to vistas we create, unless we step into someone else's meditation, then which ancient one dreamt this intersection of lines? The distant trucker, the men, and myself, who wander past a length of road into spirals so carefully engraved. Our crossing notches a groove in my palm, a new map I now see in my hands. Thank you. So thank you. So I think we have time for questions. I think we have quite some time for questions. So you started to ask about imagery and started to ask about some of those perspectives. How do you decide to zoom in or do the panorama? What are some other questions that you might have regarding your own writing or something to do, again, with imagery, landscape, or any of the poems that you heard? Oh, is it not working? Oh, questions go to the microphone. Thank you. Okay, thank you. So any questions, any follow-up about some things that you were thinking about, especially about the landscapes that you have even in your mind, and kind of what is vivid to you with regards to those landscapes? Yes, Basil.
Curious what your process was drafting the Sandman poem. Where did you start? Did you know where you were going with it? How was it like drafting the sections there?
Thank you. That's an excellent question because it was a process. I had gone to the Botanical Gardens in Phoenix and began to think about this story of the brother and sister. And so I wrote the first 5 poems, I think, maybe first 4 poems. I kind of wrote those in a set. And then I set them aside, trying to think, well, what direction do I want this to go? What is the story behind this? And I also wanted to consider, well, I want some other other image to come in and to actually dissolve the Sandman. And especially with some of the ways in which I was using a very dark notion of that myth. So I did a little more research and found the desert flower, the night blooming cereus, and decided that's going to be the image that's going to show up at some point in this poem. So the first 3 or 4 sections were written close together, and then they sat for a few years because I just didn't have the time, or just thinking about, okay, I need to set that aside for a little bit. Then I did a lot of research about sand. That was another process I went through. And I just researched everything. What is it made of? What are the different kinds of sands? What kind of makes it? And I did a lot of research on the myth as well. So I could take what it was that was going to work for me in that poem. I mentioned earlier the idea of residences. I took drafts of these poems to the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts. And I actually worked sometimes around the clock on reading about the sand, but also drafting more poems and trying to really get to the center or the heart of what that sequence was. And when I figured out the healing image, what I call that, that began to also take shape in another way as to when I wanted to introduce that. I teach the lyric sequence in my classes, and so what I teach when I teach that sequence is when you're going to arrange several poems, they kind of play off each other. So these pieces had to play off each other in various ways as well. So the arrangement of them was just as important as the writing and the composition. I had a different ending of this poem for several years, and I didn't like the ending that I had because it did not feel right. And so that's why I finally decided what needs to end is that penny beneath the burning bush, or beneath the bush. It's got to end with that. That is the closure that I wanted. And that took another year or so to find. So it is a process, a long process. And partly it's because there are other things that I do as well, in my life. So I kind of grab these moments but I'm thinking about them a lot. And then I take the time to execute what I've been thinking about in the writing process. So that was sort of how that came about. But going to the botanical garden, there was actually an artist there who had an exhibit of snakeskin and shells and coils. And so I saw that, and they were really diadems that she was sort of doing. And that also gave some influence for some of the imagery in the poem. And then other of it just came again from that sort of organic process that's kind of a mysterious process in many ways. But there was a deliberate sense of, I need to see this through, and I've got to find a way to do that. And it's one of the few poems where I've deliberately found some other image that's going to come into it.
So you talk about the concept of memory and time, and I wonder if you could say a little bit more about change over time. So how landscapes change, especially in one of your poems, I think the first one where you mentioned the Parawan Gap.
Yes.
You talked about an intersection that hadn't changed for 30 years.
Oh, right. Right. I do mention the Parawan Gap in that, and I talked about 3 exits. So I live in a town of 3 exits, as if I'd lived for the same day for 30 years. Yeah.
So how do you think about when these sacred places that mean so much to you, when they change, in kind of drastic ways that maybe create a disturbance of the memory?
That's a really, really good question. There's a term called solastalgia, which some of you might be familiar with. It is a term that refers to, it's a different term than nostalgia. Nostalgia, you have a nostalgia for time and place and memory that you can't go back to. It's the past you can't return to. Solastalgia is a sort of mourning for a place you can return to, but it has changed so much it's no longer the place that you once knew. So maybe a place where you rode your bikes through and now there's a mall there, or there's a building and something's disrupted that. So you were asking, how do you write about that, or how does that, what is it like to go back to some of these places? I think that that's a really good question because I've seen places change a little bit in Cedar City because of just development and the expansion of that. Even the petroglyphs, you used to be able to walk right up to them, and you could be right close to them. And now there's a gate or a fence around them and some interpretive signs. So it does feel different than when I used to go there where there wasn't anything, and you'd walk there and you would just see these rocks, and it felt like a very powerful place. It still does, but it is slightly different with some of that, a barrier between yourself and that. When I go back to Charlottesville, there are places that have changed, but there are other places that haven't. There's just a lot more people, a lot more traffic. And so if anybody's been through Charlottesville, you kind of know that the periphery has grown a lot. But there's still some things that are the same. So I think that, and then Zion National Park, we were talking earlier about how the parks, there are so many people that now go to they discover these parks after COVID. So it's not the same place that it was, in the late 80s when I was going to that after my mother had moved to St. George. And even where she lived is no longer that. So there is a kind of, in some ways, maybe we write about these places to preserve them for what we know, or we remember them, what we remember about them. And then some places are still the same. But when returning to a place, for me, it was very hard to return to Virginia for a long time because I didn't have family there. I didn't have my house there. So it wasn't that the place had changed, the circumstances had changed. And I felt a little bit like when you cross a line in time that you can't go back to, that's a very profound loss. When you can't retrieve that place, you can't retrieve that time. You cannot go back and change it. And that was a loss that I carried when I would return. And so it was hard for me, even if they had changed somewhat, I'm trying to see how I can put this right. It's as if the ghosts of my family were there, but I could not find them. I don't know if that makes sense. My memories of them, the places we went to, but they were not there in the same way as they were when I was growing up because of the changes, the death of my father and other changes as well. So. But yeah, that's a good question.
Danielle, I have two questions.
Yeah.
You talked about setting aside the Sandman for a while.
Yeah.
How many set-asides do you have?
Oh, currently? How many set-asides do I currently have? Is that what you're asking? Mm-hmm. I've got a lot. I have a collection of essays that are building on the essay Juliet that won that award. There's about 8 or 9 of them I've written, and I now need to just finish them. They're done. I just need to complete those. And then after writing this book, and there's some poems that didn't end up in this book that I need to sort of kind of go back and begin to construct another poetry book. So there are a few set-asides that I have.
And what's next for Danielle?
So what's next would be working on this collection of essays, which is going back to Charlottesville, going back to that time and reconciling sort of that grief a little bit, but other aspects of that place. And then I have started to write some other poems that are taking a different direction. And I unfortunately I was going to read one tonight and I left it behind, so I don't have that. But I'm interested in this idea of kind of focusing on this final image, and having how does that resonate for the rest of the pieces, the rest of the poems. But right now it's the essays that I'm kind of focusing on to complete those, so I can kind of have that be done and out of the way. And I feel like I'll have some time now to do that. But I think it's a good question about what do we set aside, and at what point as writers can we come back and pick that up? And I often find what I appreciate is I can pick it up like an old friend, just like an old friend you haven't seen for years. No conversation needs to happen. You just pick up and you're back where you were, where you started. So that's how I feel it is for me anyway.
You mentioned having an intentional arrangement of the sections for the Sandman poem.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about your process and inspiration for figuring that out, and also like the arrangement of the poems or your upcoming essay collection?
That's a really So it's a question that has lots of answers to it. So I'll start with the essay, and I'll kind of go back to the Sandman poem. The essays that I have right now are ones that they're addressing the times that I lived in Charlottesville in the 1970s. So they're going back to sort of this window of time when there was a lot going on in Charlottesville that I was not aware of, a lot going on nationally and internationally that I was peripherally connected to because of some work that my father did. And so I'm kind of trying to unearth some things that I'm kind of going back and seeing, well, what were some connections that he had, and what were some other aspects of that time that, being a teenager, that I might not have been as aware of. And those essays also interweave currently, and this is not current now, but for the past 4 years, I was helping my mother with health issues, and I was going between Cedar City and St. George to help her almost every other week. And so it also incorporates her memory changes, and what's changing for her in terms of her memory, and where am I in that sense of things, because she did not remember anything of that time that I grew up. And so I'm kind of recovering a little bit in that process. She passed away in November, at the end of October. Her funeral was in November. And so there's some essays kind of address that. So they're past, but also current. And how I arrange them is very tricky, because they should read as a piece. And so they can dovetail a little bit, but I'm not sure if I'm going to go chronologically past to present, or if I'm going to have more of a braided sense of things with that structure. And so I don't know if that answers that question regarding those essays. And then with the Sandman, it really was something that this was a topic, this was a story that was really hard to try to write. And I wanted to be able to do it justice for what I understood. But at the same time, the Sandman poem, it's a myth, is very dark. And I don't really like engaging with that myself. So I really had to just gingerly work with it. And one of the essays that really inspired me was an essay by Gregory Orr, where he talks about the threshold. It's from a book called Poetry as Survival. And he says, he talks about how poets, it's not his theory, but the idea that there's a linguistic strength that poets or writers have. With this linguistic strength, they can maybe go to places that not everybody can go to, and they can transform what he called the nightmare into something else. They can transform it and change it to where it's their own. They change it to what they want it to be. And that concept really influenced me, because I thought, this is going to a threshold of encountering this Sandman. And if I'm going to cross that threshold, I need to have this other image that's going to be there as a strengthening image. And so it was a very deliberate process, but it was slow, because I just had to take my time in doing that. And also doing all the research to make sure there was some of that right. And what Orr argues, and whether he's accurate or not, but he argues that when you read a poet's work and you follow their journey, they've done the work for you to transform that nightmare into something else. And that kind of goes back, my interest in poetry as therapy, is I do think poetry has a very profound, powerful effect. When we read poetry, we ourselves don't maybe have to write about that journey, but we read someone else's and we see how they transformed it into something that becomes their own. And it's no longer a nightmare that haunts, but is they've changed it, they've created something else completely different in that. And it has to do with that power of words, that linguistic strength, as he puts it. So again, I hope that answered a little bit of your question without going into too much.
Were you a writer when you were in Virginia, and how did that landscape affect your writing compared to how being out in Utah changes your writing?
Yes, yeah. So I was a writer there as well. I was a writer from the time I was little. I was dictating stories to my mother, and she would write them down, and I would make a book for me. And so I was I was reading poetry since I was little. So that was something I was always connected to. So I wrote in high school. I wrote poems in high school. And when I went to college for the first year, was still writing poems. But it probably, Virginia that landscape might not have meant as much had I not left it. Because I didn't take it for granted, but I loved it on so many levels. And you're from Virginia as well, so you kind of know that there's just something different about these two landscapes. And going back to what we carry with us in terms of that landscape, I wrote more about it when I knew I couldn't go back to it. In a way, I idolized it. And I probably idolized it in certain ways that, that if I'd lived there might not be the case. It might not be the case in that same way, and I'm kind of aware of that. But yes, I did write a lot of poems about the South, about the beach, about growing up there when I was there, because those were the places and the imagery that meant so much to me. And I kept trying to find water and beach in even my desert poems, and you can see in those first few poems that was kind of the case. But and when I go back, the reason why the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts is a place I love to go back to is because I do feel like I can connect to that again. But just one last thing regarding, it was a poet, Leslie Norris, who was a great mentor for me in college and began to take my poetry seriously. Before that time, there weren't a lot of teachers that were that interested in it. There weren't creative writing classes and that kind of thing. So you just wrote poems kind of on the side. But when I began to work with him and he introduced me to some poets, that's when I started to be really interested in the imagery, place, landscape. It kind of began to unlock for me then. So, bless you. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you so much. Thank you again. Thanks again to Barry and to everybody else on the board. I really appreciate being invited here and being a part of this and your questions as well. So thank you again. Thanks.